With infinite complacence, people went to and fro over the earth about their little affairs, serene in the assurance of their dominion over this small, spinning fragment of solar driftwood, which by chance or design, man has inherited out of the dark mystery of time and space.
Good evening and welcome to Into the Fray. My name is Shannon LeGros. Tonight on Into the Fray, I'm speaking to David Paulides, and if you are not familiar with him, he has been entangled in a phenomena for years, and he writes the Missing 411 series. If you haven't touched one of his books, I highly recommend before you read his newest one, A Sobering Coincidence, pick up one of the prior books. Get familiar with the profile points because people going missing under strange circumstances is much more prevalent than we thought. If you thought you were safe just staying out of the woods, think again, because now all the profile points, with a couple added in, have found us in our urban settings. I am very honored to have him on tonight to talk about one of my favorite mysteries. Dave, I would be remiss if I didn't start off by asking you what started you researching this topic and a little about your professional background in case there are some folks out there that don't know.
So I spent 20 years in law enforcement in California in a municipal law enforcement capacity. I worked detective, street crime, SWAT team, MERGE, vice intelligence, almost all specialized units while I was there. After that, I went on to add a master's degree in HR. I went on and worked in a series of technology jobs in Silicon Valley. And then after that, I tried to retire, got pulled back in again, and I was at a national park doing some peripheral research on another topic. Some park rangers were following me around. At the end of the day, I had a knock on the door of the place I was staying outside the park. One of the park rangers said that they had an interesting story to tell me, and they went on to say that they had worked at a series of parks. They had experienced many disappearances that were, to them, odd. And during that 7 to 10 day cycle, there were a lot of press, a lot of publicity, a big effort to find the individual. At the end of that initial time period, it essentially just dried up. There were no more efforts. There was no more follow-up. There was nothing. As this person went on to other parks and started to talk to other rangers, they were experiencing the same thing at other locations. And they felt that the Park Service wasn't doing enough to follow up, wasn't doing enough to keep track of it. And in their efforts to try to find out whatever happened, they encountered some of the same problems I've experienced and I've explained over the last several years. So after I left the lodge the next morning, I explained to some law enforcement friends what had happened. I said, hey, could you look into it and see if there's anything unusual here? Within a couple hours, they called and said, yes, there's something here. Some of these parks have an extraordinarily large amount of missing people, and they're still missing. So that kind of started everything, and we're about 5-6 years later. Here we are today with 5 books.
And Dave, would you mind giving a quick bullet point rundown of the profile points from your previous books?
So probably the number one is about 95% of the cases, canines, bloodhounds that are brought to the scene, they can't pick up a scent. Trackers can't find tracks of the person leaving the area and can't track them to a definitive location. If you're in the western U.S., boulders are involved in the disappearances many times, whether the person's found in a boulder field or they're lost adjacent to a boulder field. If the person's found alive, 90% of the time or more, they can't explain what happened to them. Many times the people that are found alive have some kind of mental disorder that restricts their ability to communicate, meaning they're deaf, they have autism, dementia, etc. There's kind of two ends of that spectrum of cognizance and ability. There's usually one end where the people are super smart, physicists, physicians, then another end where there's dementia, autism involved, and people just can't explain what happened to them. There's also an unusual part where very young children, if they're involved, many times they cover extraordinary distances or they go to extraordinary heights that nobody can quite understand how they got there. Another part of it is many people, if they're found dead or alive, they're found in an area that has been searched sometimes dozens, maybe 100 times, and the searchers can't explain how they missed them. Other times, the person is found, they're missing clothing or they're missing shoes, even though it might be a real warm day, no hypothermia is involved. They're found shoeless, pantless, shirtless, and sometimes the clothing is never found. Those are some of the big things. On the East Coast, the only difference is that swamps and bogs are involved much more than they are on the West Coast.
And also, the Park Service claimed to you they have no list of the missing people, but yet if there was such a list, it would cost you outrageous amounts of money to get the names of those people.
Yeah, correct. When we first started, we knew that the National Park Service had one of the largest contingents of federally trained law enforcement officers. Some of the people out there don't understand that, but there are law enforcement officers attached to the Park Service that carry guns, and their specific duty is law enforcement, arresting, citing, criminally prosecuting things that happen inside the park. Those officers are trained at the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center in Glencoe, Georgia. They're some of the best trained officers in the United States. They work at a variety of parks. They move around in their career. If they want to move up the chain, they can become a detective, and in their administration, it's called a special agent, just like an FBI special agent, and they're trained equally as well. And so if there's a crime in a national park, all follow-up and detective work is done by a National Park Service special agent. They have an associated administration at each park, and then they also have an upper administration in Washington, D.C. Now, these police officers in this police department, the U.S. Park Police, definitely know how to do the job the correct way, and they understand the importance of missing people. And obviously, if you had a grouping of missing people in one area of one park, it'd be important to know that because many missing person cases turn into criminal cases. And as they state, they just rely on the institutional memory of their employees for a list of missing people. They say that they don't have any lists of missing people.
That's actually pretty terrifying.
Well, I think most of the journalists that read about it, the ones I've talked to, they don't believe it. They think that the Park Service is lying. I don't know.
Yeah. So, everybody, the new book is Missing 411, A Sobering Coincidence. And George Knapp is the one that mentioned you would probably find yourself in the city someday, and here we are. These are cases of mostly young men. They go out drinking. They are found later deceased in bodies of water. You even said it's almost like a culling of the best. These are intelligent and driven young people. Their studies read like a who's who of the up-and-comers in the U.S. There's a handful of engineers, a few med students, pharmacology, an FBI agent, physician, as you've mentioned before, and even a research scientist working with Atomic Energy of Canada, and we'll cover his case later. But these guys, and there are a few women, which we'll touch on briefly, these guys had everything in front of them, and they had no reason to do something drastic or stupid to get them killed.
Well, I think that the knee-jerk reaction when you hear about a bunch of drunk college-age men that disappear and are found in water that runs through a city that they were in, hey, you know what, stuff happens, right? It could happen to anybody. And initially, when I heard about this, that was kind of my reaction. But after I got off the call with George one day, we sent back and forth a series of emails, and I took what he said seriously. And I said, you know what, I can't have tunnel vision on this because you don't know how many spokes there are in this wheel. I'm gonna keep an open mind. And within a couple of weeks of that, I started looking into this specific issue. And I got into some of the minutia of the data, and right away I said, wow, there's something here that is really, really unusual. And I would say a large percentage of these cases across the U.S. and Canada have been whitewashed by whether it's the police department, I doubt it, or it's the medical examiner, I doubt it. Somebody is burying these cases, and trying to make it seem as though it's a normal disappearance. And I'm somebody who deals in facts, and once you get down and you look at the facts, the numbers, the clustering effect, geography-wise, you start to realize there's a lot of things that are in common with what I've written in past books. And some of these families have thought like I did, and they didn't believe the coroners, the medical examiners, and the police officers that worked their son's or daughter's case. And they said, hey, I'm going to go out and I'm going to get a second opinion because I want to know the truth. And these second opinions came in and were, in my words, sobering.
Yeah, and it was those second opinions that actually brought out these incredibly disturbing facts in most of the cases.
Exactly. And my question is, what happened to the first coroner's report? How did they miss all this?
Right. And Dave, do you think that's a case of just that particular coroner's ego getting in the way of he doesn't want to, write down that he has no idea what's going on, or do you think it goes higher than that?
So in the book, I give a lot of credit to this, to a retired detective from New York named Kevin Gannon. I've never met him. I've never talked to him. I've just read a lot what he did. And he was a missing persons detective in New York. And I got to tell you that being a missing persons detective in any city is probably looked at as one of the worst jobs in the detective division, because you spend thousands of hours working these cases, and 99% of the cases end up being a voluntary disappearance. The person didn't want to be found. They just want to fall out of society. And you do all this work and you find the person and you go, oh, there's nothing here. The person just, why are we following this lead if he didn't even want to be found? But Gannon did something different. First of all, he's a smart guy. And he started to look at some disappearances in New York that matched this profile of drunk college kids disappearing. And the locations that these college kids were in didn't make sense to him. Just like the rangers that first talked to me, the location of some of the disappearances they worked didn't make sense to them. Well, Gannon said, I need to do some tests because I don't even believe a body could go in the water at point A and end up in point B. Or, it doesn't even appear that this body's been in the water the entire time the person's been missing. And he started to put it together, and then he started to track it, and he started to figure out, wow, there's more than one of these. The person's been missing for maybe 30 days, but they've only been in the water for maybe 7 days. So where have they been for the other 2 weeks, 3 weeks? So the question comes up, why do some of these reports not indicate the truth? And I use Gannon's quote, and that is, local reports for local consumption. And what that means is that you're in a little city in Wisconsin or Minnesota, and you have a kid that drowns in the water. Who's going to ever read it? Why cause a big deal? We don't need the disruption in the city.
Mm-hmm.
Why put the family through heartache and turmoil? Hey, the kid probably drowned. Maybe he didn't. I don't know. But let's just put he drowned and put it away, and that's it. And I don't think anybody ever realized that we'd put together, over 100 cases, and there's probably 3 or 4 times that many that I don't know that all match this profile.
And you actually cite case studies in drowning forensics a number of times in your book, and that was written by Kevin Gannon and D. Lee Gilbertson. And it sounds like a fascinating book. These are no-nonsense guys, military background, law enforcement background, like you said. And even they're going, hey, there's something extremely strange and disturbing going on here. They
do. And I think they were looking at a specific area, and they were a local kind of team, maybe looking a little bit at New York, maybe looking a little bit at Wisconsin. But they didn't have that view from like 30,000 feet like I have, because I've been looking at this for so many years.
Right.
And so I'm looking at it from the entire world, and son of a gun, if cases like this haven't happened at other places in the world, fitting exactly what's happening here in the U.S. So I don't blame them for not seeing it, but then once you read the other books and you start to see the parallels between the disappearances, like George Napa said, wow, it would take somebody who really knew the topic to put these things together in an understandable way that, this is really a mass issue that isn't confined to just one area of the U.S.
Dave, have you been in contact with Gannon and Gilbertson or either of those gentlemen? Do they know of you and your work?
So I sent Gilbertson an email at his school. He didn't respond, and I have never tried to get a hold of Gannon.
It would be really interesting to get you guys talking.
I think initially they may think that what I've done is a lot of BS. And I say that only because there's been tons of articles written about these kind of things. And they think, oh, this is probably just another guy writing another book where he has these loosely tied things and he's trying to make a connection. It's probably not even worth our time reading. But in reality, I probably six times the amount of time into this project as even they did at their most. But I can't get them to even acknowledge it at this point, so that's okay.
Right, because they have, is it 12 or 14 cases in the book?
Right.
Yeah. And as I mentioned before, it is mostly college-age males, but there are 6 females in the book, and it's interesting because there's even a little clustering going on with the females. There's a locational or geographical clustering, and then maybe a new time cluster starting. There's, at the same college, it was in Massachusetts, 2 women on the same day 3 years apart were found dead. And then Elisa Lam, who could be her own whole show. I purposely didn't choose her because I figured you would probably be covering her many a times. You know, she died in 2013 in LA and Kaylin Lauder in Utah in 2014. So it almost seems like, you know, there's other clusters, you know, starting up again.
You know, I kicked around with Lauder the issue because it kind of sticks out there in the middle of Utah by itself, and I might get some conflict about it, but her case mimics so much of the other cases that it was just something you had to put in.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And in fact, she's one of the ones that I wanted to mention as far as just a quick snapshot case point, because there's something that stood out that was so disturbing in what you wrote about, and that's the fact that there have been actual documented phone calls that some of these young people had placed for help, and it proves that they're confused and that they're scared. Case in point, let's go right to Kaylin Lauder. She placed a 911 call and is heard screaming at someone. She's in her house, mind you, everybody. She's screaming at someone to get out of her house, and the 911 dispatcher said they could hear her roommate telling her, Kaylin, there's no one in the home. There's later video of her walking her dog and talking to someone who isn't there, and that's just like Elisa Lam. Everybody can go watch that video. Kaylin leaves the home in bare feet, no keys, no wallet, and out into the rain, and later found dead in the middle of a river. So it's proven that some of these folks, they're seeing something that's not normal, and it frightens them, and it seems almost like, you know, the confusion leads them to a certain location and away from safety.
You know, I don't really know what to make of it, because in Kaylin's case, it was also weather related. There was bad weather in the area, like in the other books I've written about. There was a small creek near her house, but detectives stated and proved that even if she went into that creek and went unconscious, there wasn't enough water to wash her to the river where she was found. So how she got from her apartment complex to where she was eventually found is unknown. And there's I'm probably a mile wide and an inch deep. I don't know a lot about a lot of things, but I know a little about a lot. And I try to read as many books as I can on a variety of topics because, again, that's one of the ways I found out about this. But there's a story out there in a book called Chameleon, Chameleon, Chameleon. And it's about stealth technology, and the story's about an individual who sees people in his apartment. And through a roundabout way, he meets someone, this is all true, who develops some technology that can essentially make you invisible. And others can't see it, but some people can see it under certain circumstances. And a certain person out there that's very, very underlying, very well respected told me about this a while ago. And he said, Dave, this is going to hit square on with some of the people in the books you've written about over the years. And them claiming to see something, hey, maybe they really did see something, or maybe somebody really was following them. And after you get into the context of this book, it's enough to shake you at your core, because there apparently is some technology out there that this could happen with. And, you know, I'm not putting my entire faith in it, but I am saying it appears that it exists.
Well, that's interesting. I've already written that down to check out. Yeah, even Brandon Swanson, He got his car stuck and he calls his parents to pick him up. And he states that he hears water and he yells, "Oh shit." The phone goes dead. And just like Kaylin, he ends up being found expired quite a ways, actually, from where he told his parents he was even going to be located. So there's just massive amounts of confusion and fear going on.
Actually, Brandon is one of those few cases where he was never found. His car was found, but Brandon wasn't found. They kind of tracked him to a field area, and detectives said that they didn't believe he could actually be in any of the rivers that they searched. He just kind of disappeared in the middle of nowhere, and his family couldn't get closure. And then he stated he was in a specific area, and he took a specific route to school every day. He couldn't have been lost. And the area they eventually found the car was nowhere near the location he stated he thought he was. And that threw everybody. And
this is an area, obviously, like you said, these people, they know, they live there. Some of them have lived there their whole lives. There's no way they could have been that turned around.
No, that's a surprising thing.
So, Dave, let's dig into some of the profile points for a sobering coincidence a little bit more. First of all, the clusters. Wisconsin is the main one, and it's a lot like, the other books where the middle of the country, there's almost nothing.
Correct. Right down north to south through the middle, almost down through Texas, North Dakota, South Dakota, right down south, nothing.
Okay, because here's one of the things that popped into my head. When you talk about down south, there's plenty of water down there. So it's a little odd that we don't have cases down there. If you just assume, oh, well, college kids are getting drunk and falling in the water, big deal. Well, there's plenty of water down around there too, right? So a lot of that just, doesn't stand up.
And I get asked this a lot privately is, why does Mississippi and Louisiana almost have zero? There's one in Louisiana, that's it. But why do those two states that should have tons of disappearances matching this have zero? And that's the million-dollar question. What I tell people is, back in the law enforcement days when we were chasing serial robbers or burglars, we'd always take a map out of the city and map where all these locations occurred. And what you'd find is that within, say, a 2-mile radius of the suspect's house, they would do no crime because they didn't want any focus on where they lived. And so you'd start 2, 3 miles, 4 miles out, and the crime would go all the way around the house, but it would never get near the house. And I've told people before on radio and TV that, to me, those areas in the U.S. where there are no disappearances, and specifically I think there should be, really, maybe that's where the focus should be, because they don't want us to look there. They don't want to draw attention to that area.
That's a good point. I've never thought about it like that. The forensic side of it. Unfortunately, and we can only speculate what happens to them, but many of these folks are alive for days or even weeks prior to hitting the water, and that's proven through the forensics once they get a hold of the body. In some cases, the bodily fluids are completely removed. In one case, even from the eyes you mentioned. So what's the thoughts there from everybody with things like that things that cannot be done just out in the field somewhere, by some random serial killer?
So I get a lot of people who listen to 1 or 2 interviews on me and they think that they understand what's happening. And in this specifically, in just this book, I think the forensics take it to a point where if it's humans doing this, I don't understand how they're doing it, because nobody ever sees a body getting dumped in the water.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody ever sees somebody pulling somebody out of a bar or dragging somebody down the street against their will. In none of these cases has that ever happened. The cameras that are watching bars and streets and locations never see anything unusual, sometimes never even see the victim. And to get from A to B, they almost have to walk past this location, but they're not seen. In one case specifically out of Ohio, a guy was in a bar and a detective looked at dozens and dozens and dozens of hours of videotape over and over and over again, said, hey, that man did not come out of that bar because every exit was covered with CCTV. So how did he get out of the bar? I mean, these kind of things can't be answered easily. And I think what I found in just the last month is that mainstream reporters are very uncomfortable about even talking about it. Even though I deal in just the facts, I'm not making any hypothesis, nobody wants to even talk about it. It's too touchy.
And is there any sexual assault involved in any of these cases?
Never. If there is, I think it would have been brought out and disclosed on a second autopsy, but it's never reported. I think it would be, but it's not.
And again, as in the previous books, personal items, shoes and clothes, either missing or put back on strangely, or just in one case, a man, I think he was either wearing shorts and ended up in pants or vice versa, just completely strange. Folded. Some of the items are found folded neatly in an area previously searched. Again, the same profile points. And to me, Dave, it almost seems like obviously they are placed there as a mockery.
Well, whatever the reason, I think a couple of things are obvious. The placement of the bodies are there to be found because whoever's doing this, whatever's doing this, they could put the bodies anywhere, any place that they want, and they're not. They're placing them back in the location to be found very close to where they disappeared in areas that had been searched many, many, many times before, and then bango, all of a sudden the person appears just like in the other 4 books.
Right.
So somebody wants to send a message that, hey, we can probably do this anywhere we want. You're not going to be able to touch us. And a lot of people said, well, it must be some gangland style killer or some serial killer. No, if you understand how many times this is happening across the world, it's not anybody doing it. Nobody is that good that they wouldn't get caught or they wouldn't get seen.
Yeah, and I don't know how you can rig CCTVs, as you mentioned, across the world to make sure that you don't ever end up on anybody's video. Not even a glimpse.
No, and that's another big part of it that, I don't get it. I don't understand how anybody or anything could do it, but it's obviously happening because the evidence is there.
We were mentioning the second autopsies and the fact that there are some absolutely disturbing things being found only on the second autopsies, mind you. There is a new profile point, and that is the fact that GHB, in some cases in high doses, is being found in these young people.
So GHB is a naturally produced inside the body in minute quantities. Now, GHB, as the public knows it, is known kind of like the date rape drug, meaning that if somebody gives it to you, you will lay there. You will know what's happening to you, but you won't be able to fight. It's almost as though you're paralyzed. So in second autopsies, in many, many of these instances, they're finding super high levels of GHB in the body. Now, the issue with this is that GHB is not one of the drugs or the narcotics that is on the screening list for 95% of the medical examiners in the U.S. So unless they're got their wits up about them and a flashing yellow light, they're never, ever going to test for it. Now, every time I see one of these cases now, the first question going back at the corner is, did you test for GHB? And most of the time, they're not. So imagine this. Somehow or another, somebody has your son who's 20 years old. He's a stud athlete on scholarship to a major university somewhere in the Great Lakes area, and they're giving him a huge quantity of GHB. That poor kid knows he's alive. He's breathing fine, but he can't move. Then, somehow or another, they dump you in a river, and you're going to sink because you can't swim because you're paralyzed. And when your body's found, it's going to look like you drowned. And 99% or 99.9%, no one's going to test for GHB, and they're going to find high levels of alcohol in you, and, it's a stupid kid got drunk and drowned. Now, there may be somebody out there who's just going to listen to this 2-minute section of our interview, and they're going to say, oh, this guy's an idiot. That kind of stuff doesn't happen, and, this is just a complete fabrication of facts. But you know what? It's all out there. It's in black and white. This isn't me hypothesizing. This is what's happening.
All right, Dave, let's go and get into a few of the cases, if you don't mind. Paul Gagola, back in 1984. Can you tell everybody what happened to Paul?
So this is California, Pennsylvania. He's going to a place called California University in Pennsylvania. He's a student, junior year in business. He's from New Salem, Pennsylvania, about 12 miles south of California, Pennsylvania. In high school, he was a competitive swimmer, won a lot of his meets. He was an excellent student athlete, and he was a member of the Delta Sigma Phi social fraternity, and just an all-around good guy. Well, on October 28th, 1984, Paul spent the majority of the day with his girlfriend and his family at his family's home. And he arrived at the family's home at about 7. He picked up some clothes in his room for a Halloween party. He had dinner with his folks. His mom gave him some food to take back to school. And he watched TV until about 9 o'clock with his family. Now, later on that night, as he's driving back to school, a California city police officer in Pennsylvania sees him running a red light. This happens at about 12:30 a.m. He was warned about running the red light. He wasn't cited. He wasn't drunk, and he was released. Now, this is important because at 12:30 a.m., a police officer stops him. He's not drunk. He's not drunk driving. So to be stopped and arrested for drunk driving is different than being arrested for being drunk in public. Essentially, nationally, the limit for drunk driving is 0.08% of alcohol in your system. Now, you could walk around, you won't be staggering, et cetera, at 0.08. But to be arrested for being drunk in public, you got to be staggering. You got to be a danger to yourself or others. You can't be able to take care of your welfare. So Paul wasn't either one of those. The guy said there was no mention of alcohol even in his system, and the police officer lets him on his way. It was raining that time of the morning on October 29th. Sometime after that stop, and they don't know the exact time, but Paul's car hits a guardrail and a signpost. What's important about this is that in the reports it said that there were no skid marks, meaning the car went along, hit the guardrail, and slowly came to a stop over 200 feet away with no skids or no immediate stop. It just kind of hit and kept gliding along. When the police got there, there was nobody in the car. They ran the registration and they found out it was Paul's. So they called his dorm room. Nobody answered. They went to the dorm room. Or they called the room and the phone was busy. They went to the room. They talked to the roommate. Roommate said he saw him earlier in the evening but hadn't seen him in a long time. That was at about 2 a.m. And that was it. No keys were in the car and no blood was in the car. Accident happened about 3/4 of a mile away from the Monongahela River that flows through California, PA. Well, the area around the car was searched extensively and nothing unusual was found. Paul didn't show up back at the room. The next day his parents reported him as a missing person. Now, on the face right there, you wouldn't think much about it. I mean, obviously nobody's injured in the car. It wasn't a severe accident. There's no blood in the car, no obvious signs of injury. And police officers stopped him earlier in the evening, and he was fine. Fast forward to 3-4 days later, November 3rd, 84, about 9:15 a.m., somebody sees a body floating 25 feet east of the shore, eastern shore on the river. Police pull out, this is about 2 miles south of California, PA. They pull out Paul's body. And the coroner does a autopsy and found his blood alcohol level is below the legal limit. His is at 0.05, and the coroner ruled it was drowning. Coroner said that the body was in the river a minimum of 3 days. He'd been missing 4 days. His vehicle traveled 272 feet after contacting the guardrail, no skids. They had what's called a coroner's jury, where a bunch of citizens hear the evidence, and they were uncomfortable enough to leave the case open in case something else came along, which is pretty unusual when a coroner comes out and says, well, he drowned, and that's really the end. Well, there was bad weather. It had been raining slightly that night. So some things to consider is, first of all, Paul was a competitive swimmer. If his blood alcohol level was 0.05 when he drowned, I can guarantee he could swim really good. And why didn't Paul swim to safety? Why was he in the river? How did he get in the river? Why didn't he brake abruptly like everybody else would if he hit a guardrail? Why wasn't he in the car? And how did he get from the car to the river? Like I said, it makes no sense.
And, you know, the irony of him being a competitive swimmer, and as you mentioned, he was not staggering drunk. There was no reason for him not to be able to easily handle whatever situation may have brought him to the river. Like you said, we don't know. But there's also a case in your book on the other end of the spectrum where a young man was deathly afraid of the water and he ended up dead in a river. It's just two totally different ends of the spectrum with the same outcome.
Well, I think anybody, even if they're a competitive swimmer, I think between you and me and 100 other people, we would be hard-pressed to find one of our friends on a cold, wet, October night, when it's dark, it's rainy, that anybody even in their worst frame of mind, would want to go take a swim in the Monongahela River.
Right.
And then I think it would be fairly safe to say that even after we've had a couple of drinks, we're not going to even go down near the river.
Yeah, I don't know what the draw would be for anybody to just go on a leisurely swim in a river while it's already raining. You're already getting wet. You just had an accident, obviously. So, yeah, it doesn't make any sense.
No.
And next we have Ben Feuder from Wisconsin, July 2012.
Yeah, he was in Whitewater, Wisconsin. This is the second case of a Whitewater student that University of Wisconsin at Whitewater that disappeared in a 14-month cycle. Great student athlete. He was a tennis player. He was actually good enough to qualify for the Wisconsin State Tennis Tournament. He was attending University of Wisconsin, majoring in elementary education. July 28, 2012, he went with friends drinking to a bar in downtown Whitewater. And this is directly across the street from a place called Kravitz Lake, small little lake in the middle of the city. Friends told him that he had enough, and they sent him home. So he was on his way home. He lived in the city. He knew the area like the back of his hand. Someone found his phone somewhere in the city, called his girlfriend to return it. Someone else supposedly found his wallet in a stairwell. That was unconfirmed. But his body was found the next day at 6:45 a.m. in a quarry outside of town. And police said he fell 70 feet to his death. His family called the situation suspicious. Now, that is the second person in that town to die under those conditions. The second one was a guy named Mark Wagner. Now, when Ben left that bar, he had gotten something to eat before he died. And he would have had to have walked past his own home to the quarry, the same sort of path that Mark Wagner took to get to the quarry, if they walked. And they both supposedly had to go over 2 strands of barbed wire that encircled the quarry. But there's never any mention on the coroner's report about being scratched severely, and there's no notation about it. Now, in Ben's case, his blood alcohol level was a 0.11, which was identical to Wagner's. In Ben's case, they said that he died of traumatic brain injury. Now, what I talk about in these cases is that I did a video about a physician named Jim McGrogan out of Indiana that was found outside of Vail in Colorado, where he died of traumatic brain injury. He was wearing a helmet, yet there was really no place for him to fall from. And there was also cases I wrote about in this book in Quebec involving 2 boys who fell into something almost identical to a quarry as well. The reality is that Mark Wagner and Ben Feuder knew that quarry like the back of their hand. They knew it was nowhere near their house, but if somebody was going to die from a fall, that would have been really the only place within 100 miles that these guys could have fallen to their death and had it written off as something natural. But you got to remember, these guys were raised in that city. They knew the city. They're not that stupid. And whatever's happening here, somebody or something is trying to make it look as though, these guys were stupid, and they went over to the quarry, and what did they do? They just jump in, maybe? I don't think so. So how did they get over the barbed wire and into the bottom of the quarry to die?
It really seems like these people are being drawn to these locations, like as if they have no control over what they're doing. To walk a mile past your own house and choose to go over 2 strands of barbed wire fence into a quarry you know is dangerous. I know that they want to write these off, like you said, just as a stupid kid doing something that he shouldn't have been doing. But even at your dumbest moment, like you said, I don't think those are the choices you're going to make.
And then I think the other part of this that you have to keep in your mind is that in the times where they bring in canines, it's not like they're tracking these guys point to point.
Mm-hmm.
So when you say they're drawn, that implies that they voluntarily went point to point. But when the evidence is brought in and they show that there's no scent trail, I don't know how they got point to point.
One of the most interesting cases I found was, to me at least, Lachlan Cranswick from Deep River, Canada in 2010.
So in my past books, I have drawn similarity between what's happening in North America with missing people and what's happening in Australia with missing people. And the similarities in the cases and the facts and the profile points are identical. And same thing with Great Britain. Now, Lachlan Cranswick, 41 years old, one of the oldest guys I wrote about in the books, but I just couldn't ignore it. He was a physicist from Australia, living in Deep River, Ontario. Brilliant guy. Native of Melbourne, nuclear physicist, research scientist. Now, I've written about physicists who have disappeared before under suspicious circumstances. Almost all of them have never been found. Lachlan was found, but he was working for the Atomic Energy Commission at the Chalk River Labs in Deep River. On January 18th, 2010, he boarded a bus at Chalk River at 4:30 in the afternoon. That was the last confirmed sighting of him. It dropped him in his neighborhood, and he walked to his house. He was the kind of guy who enjoyed curling, skiing, snowshoeing, avid outdoorsman. On January 23rd, his friends expected him to be at a curling championship in Deep River for their squash club and curling club. He was the vice president. He never arrived, and people knew something was wrong. Well, he was at the time studying radioisotopes. He was chairman of an organization called the IUCR, and it was a computer commissioning organization. He was an expert on powder diffraction. And I could try to explain it to you, but look up powder diffraction, diffraction, and you could kind of understand what it is. It's pretty complicated stuff. Anyhow, after he didn't respond he didn't show up at the curling championship, police responded to his home on Chalk River to check on his welfare. And they found kind of an unusual sight. The home is in a normal housing tract. It's about 1,000 feet southwest of the Ottawa River. Officers found the front door unlocked. Lachlan wasn't home. His car was in the garage, and his GPS and wallet were found in the home. And the garbage cans were outside. Now, the night of January 18th, he would have been putting the garbage cans outside for a pickup on the 19th. So the garbage cans being outside meant that he got home, and he put them out, and it was probably at about that time something happened. Well, his computer was still in his home, garbage cans outside, a search starts immediately. And the streets, the harbors, the river, nothing's being found. They brought in canines, they couldn't track his scent, no tracks anywhere leading to the river. Now the river itself, Ottawa River, was frozen solid at this point, and the only patches that showed open water were far away from Marina, and they were visible only by a helicopter that was doing overflights. The main part of the river near his house was 4 foot thick in ice. Now they're doing all this, and his brother flies from Melbourne, flies out to Ontario to get a grasp on what's happening. And the brother gave an interview and said the circumstances of Lachlan's disappearance are, quote unquote, bizarre. The locals were interviewed and said, quote unquote, something extraordinary happened. Some people felt he was kidnapped. Now, June 11th, 2010, about 5 months after Lachlan disappears, 2 canoeists are in Walsh Bay, east of the Deep River Marina, and they find a body floating in 2.5 feet of water, and it was Lachlan. He was wearing his work coat and his lab ID. Now, in almost every instance where a kid or somebody I write about disappears, they almost always have their ID on them. And irregardless how fast the water is or whatever, damn, if they don't have their ID on them so we can easily identify who he is or who they are. And I think that's a bizarre point because if you're in fast water, it's just not going to, your wallet is not going to stay in your pants. But regardless, he's found with his ID on him. They do an autopsy, and they cannot find the cause of death. And in the stories I've written about, this is not unusual. So based on the phone and the computer logs and the garbage cans outside at 11:30, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police came up with the only thing they could think of, and that he went for a late-night walk. And his brother got interviewed later and said, authorities have no idea what happened to my brother. They're just making opinions and stating things that they have no clue and no evidence that happened. The bottom line is, it's January in Deep River, Ontario. It's freezing cold, and Lachlan takes a walk. Well, if he did take a walk, then where are the tracks leading to the river, which they never found? Where's the broken ice in the river that he would have had to have broken to fall in? Et cetera, et cetera. Again, it's one of those things that makes no sense at all. And he didn't drown because they didn't determine that in the autopsy. So how did he die?
Well, and it's strange if you did, per se. And I live in Ohio. I know how the weather is here. I wouldn't choose to go out in it, especially not in a lab coat, if that's all you're going to choose to wear in January. And Dave, as far as the cause of death, how unusual is it for no cause of death to be determined?
So it's not unheard of, but it is strange. But in the cases in this book, it's more. It almost seems as though it's more common than it should be.
Mm-hmm.
And that, to me, is concerning because, as other investigators have told me, Dave, something is happening here that's killing these people, but we aren't advanced enough to figure it out at this point.
And I'm assuming that, the canines couldn't track him, and they obviously started from his house. There was no footprints even from his house. And keep in mind, January in Canada, there's going to be snow on the ground with plenty of opportunity for tracks.
Absolutely. And I think that one of the things I talk about in all of the books is that when investigators get to the point where they've exhausted all their leads and nothing starts to make sense to them, they always use this word abduction or kidnapped. Because that's the release point. Because now they can kind of free themselves from all the liability that they can't figure out the case, and they can kind of throw that zinger out there. This is way up in the middle of nowhere, Ontario. And the idea that it was thrown out there that he was kidnapped. Nobody ever made it a point. No one's ever classified this as a kidnapping. There's never been any suspects. There's never really been any investigation. Again, this guy must have been an idiot. He must have gone out for a late night walk, fallen in the river. Hey, he's dead. That's the end of the story. But the reality is, when you look at it on its whole compared to every other case I've written about, this kind of falls right in the middle of that menagerie of unusual water deaths, smart people. I don't know what else to say.
It must be maddening for the family. Not only have they lost someone, but they've lost someone in a manner in which makes absolutely zero sense. Like Lachlan's brother said, he came home, he's still in his lab coat and ID, takes the garbage cans out, and he's already home, he's safe, he's doing his thing, and then he's just gone.
Well, a lot of people read that story and they emailed me and they said, what's scary about this story is that he was doing what we all do. You put your garbage cans out on a normal night, and that guy just vanished. And they keyed on something else you brought up, meaning the lab coat. If you're going to take a walk in the middle of January, anywhere in the northern part of North America, you're going to be wearing a little more than a lab coat.
Yeah, you couldn't pay me enough. And like I said, I didn't know until I moved here to Ohio just how cold it is. It's beyond uncomfortable. It's painful very quickly. So you would go out in much, much more than a lab coat.
Yes, I would agree.
Todd Geib from Casanova, Michigan in 2005.
Probably one of the more concerning cases I researched, and I hate to even I'm not afraid to admit it, that a lot of these cases I wrote about, I got tears in my eyes because these people were good people. And in a lot of ways, I think of myself at that age, and I could have been easily one of these guys that disappeared. And I write about how the parents have responded to it and how they're completely perplexed and how it's just completely ruined their lives. And they're going to walk around the rest of their lives thinking, what really happened? And the Geib case is one of those. June 11, 2005, 1 a.m. Casanova, Michigan is about 25 miles north of Grand Rapids. It's in one of those established cluster zones 50 miles north. It's right on the fringe. That cluster zone is right around Weber and Ludington, where it's had a lot of strange things happen to it over the years and a lot of strange disappearances. Todd was one of those outdoorsmen. He had trophy fish. He liked to deer hunt, played basketball and baseball in high school. He was smart. He had a really dry sense of humor, and he had real strong religious ties. He was raised a Protestant and a Catholic, and he really had only one vice in life, and that was smoking. He had a German and a Polish background, and a lot of these cases that I found, the people have some kind of German heritage that constantly comes up. And I don't want to make a bigger deal out of it than I did in the book, but I do think it's important to kind of keep that in the back of your mind. He had really strong family ties, and his parents lived 5 miles from him in a city called Ravenna. On June 11th, 2005, between 6 and 6:30, he drove from his parents' house, and he went back to his house where he lived with his cousin, and they spoke. At about 7:30, he drove to a local bar to meet some friends, hang out, and have some drinks. At 9:30, he left the bar, and he went to a local annual party that was being held in an orchard very near where the bar was. There was a keg, a bonfire, 50 people, a normal thing every year that the locals did. It was good weather. At about 12 a.m., Todd told some friends that he was tired and he was going to walk back to his house. Now, in the book, you're going to, as you read about these stories, there's many instances where the victim says they're tired, they don't feel well, something happens and it causes them to separate from the mass. And Todd told his friends he was tired. Well, he knew this area like you and I know our backyards that we grew up in, because this was his backyard. He spent his whole life in this area. As he leaves this party, he makes a series of 4 phone calls between 12:45 and 1 a.m. At 12:47, he calls a friend and he says he's in a field, and the call drops. Friend calls back and he thought he heard heavy breathing or wind on the phone. Another call, he called somebody and said he had trouble breathing and was in a field, and the call drops. Now, there's a couple of other series of calls that I've documented in other books. One involved a guy named Cullen Finnerty in an area 50 miles north of where Todd disappeared, where Cullen called his wife, and the wife heard heavy breathing on the phone, and the phone dropped multiple occasions. Now, on June 12th, Todd was supposed to be at a family event. He didn't show up. He was reported as a missing person at that time, and a search started. There were rumors that there was some altercation between Todd and somebody else at this party. They were investigated, found to be not true. Investigators brought trail dogs out. They couldn't find a scent anywhere of where Todd was or wasn't. On June 13th, 100 searchers combed the area with helicopters on the ground. Mass people walked in unison with each other. All the swamps in the area were searched, et cetera, et cetera. It's one of these scenarios that you think, wow, he knew the area so well. How could he get lost? But on one side of the highway there's a lake called Ovid Hall Lake. It's 1,000 feet long and it's very narrow. It's not easily accessible, but the locals know about it and fish it occasionally. You can't drive to it. You have to walk to it. Well, between May 17th and May 18th, a group of people did go to the lake, and they had site scanning fish instruments looking for fish, things on the bottom. They found nothing. On July 2nd at 5 p.m., a husband and wife are walking down to the lake, and the wife sees something odd. And what she sees protruding from the water is Todd's body. And the witnesses said it was floating like a bobber. So they pull the body out. It's Todd. His hat, his cell phone, and one shoe are missing. Now, total time he's missing is 21 days. Now, the part that shocks everybody is the location where he was found, because it had been searched multiple times. People had been in that lake with fish scanning stuff, looking at the bottom, looking at the shore, found nothing. A coroner's investigator comes out, pulls the body out of the water, and classified it as suspicious. Now, unless an investigator, police investigators there's almost no instance where a coroner investigator will classify a body as suspicious. So that was unusual right there. Now, the body didn't have any rigor mortis. There was no ice on the lake, and the coroner couldn't determine any lividity, meaning that if I kill you and immediately lay you on your back, then blood settles at the lower parts of your body, meaning it'll settle in your buttocks, in your lower back, in your shoulder blades, in your lower thighs. And that settling of blood happens all the time. That's something that we look for to see if a body's been moved or if they died in the spot we found them. Now, decomposition of the body was determined to be intermediate to moderate, not severe. He did have hair on his head, meaning he hadn't lost his hair yet. He had some swelling around the eyeballs. They couldn't determine the color of the iris of either eye, which is important. Now, Gannon and Gilbertson looked at this case, and the body was described by them as being in pristine condition for being in the water for 21 days. Todd's body had a blood alcohol level of 0.12. Again, for driving, it's 0.08, so he's a little intoxicated. He had something called contanine in his blood system, which is a byproduct of smoking. He also had dysparame, which is a depressive medication. All of his family members said he had never taken that, and they don't know why he'd have it. And they also had amitriptyline in his system, another thing that he never took, and he didn't take drugs. Now, the coroner was undetermined on the cause of death and on drowning. There was no water in his lungs. Now this is starting to sound strange. The family didn't believe that the coroner's office did a thorough enough investigation, and Gannon and Gilbertson bring in Dr. Cyril Wecht, a world-famous medical examiner, and he looks at it and he says, well, Todd was dead or unconscious when he entered the water. And investigators took photos of the body to a medical examiner's conference and showed it to the hundreds in the room. It was the unanimous opinion of everybody in the room that the body was not in the water 20-plus days. And the opinion was that Todd was held somewhere 15 to 18 days and then placed in the water. Now, at that point, you have a homicide. And the family and investigators all went to the Michigan State Police and asked them to change the cause of death from drowning to murder, and Michigan State Police wouldn't have anything to do with it. Yet, you can see by the evidence that something really, really unusual happened. Now, one point right off the bat, the people who saw the body sticking out of the water like a bobber, that never happens. In these cases, the bodies are found in positions that are never found normally. When you find a male body in water who is drowned, they float on their stomach face down. That isn't how Todd was, and nobody can explain why the body was protruding out of the water in the way it was. So you have these entire series of unusual circumstances that can't be explained, and nobody wants to even talk about it because they're too unusual. But when you look at the propensity of the evidence, Todd Geib wasn't in that lake the entire time he was missing.
Did Gannon and Gilbertson have even a fleeting guess as to how he was bobbing in that water?
No, and nobody has one.
And another thing is very interesting. Todd, you mentioned in the book, is a very large guy, and there were no roads to the lake, and he had no ligature marks, which means he wasn't tied up from what anybody could tell. How in the world did he get there? Somebody carried him there on their back?
Well, even if somebody had carried you, there would probably be some scent trail.
Mm-hmm.
There would be some tracks of somebody going near the lake. But where was he for, 2 weeks out of the 3 weeks he was missing?
It's pretty terrifying to think what they must go through. We can only imagine, and they're the only ones that know, unfortunately. And speaking of the condition that they must be in before they die, and this isn't specific to Todd's case because he had other kinds of drugs found in his system. But Dave, do you know, as far as GHB, the fact that he had mentioned, I had trouble breathing, or somebody heard wind in the background, some heavy breathing of some sort, and that's, mirrored in other cases. Do you know if GHB makes a person feel like they're having trouble breathing when in fact they're not?
The best of my knowledge is that you function normally, you just can't move. Now, there was somebody who brought up a really interesting point. And they said, on a lot of these calls, they hear heavy wind, or it's heavy breathing, or some kind of gust of wind or something. And they said, and then from that point that this person was last known to be in, they can't find a scent trail. And they said it's almost as though the person is picked up quickly, and what you're hearing is the wind of them accelerating up into the air.
And actually, that's a really good segue to something that Gannon and Gilbertson say in relation to Todd's case. And it is a quote that they made about the possible killers. And they say, they cannot be touched, they cannot be caught, they are superior. And to me, that's a profound statement for two really no-nonsense law enforcement background gentlemen to make, because we have plenty of serial killers in prison. They leave crumbs, they leave calling cards, and it's all about the profile points. And it's guys like Gannon and Gilbertson, it's their job, and it's what drives them to figure out cases like this, yet they state they cannot be caught.
Yeah, it is pretty profound. That's one reason why I included it in the book, and I thought it sort of applies to all the 1,600 cases I've acknowledged.
Absolutely. And finally, we have Dan Zamlin of St. Paul, Minnesota, April 2009.
Probably a good case to end on because of Dan's character. On April 5th, 2009, about 2:30 a.m. in St. Paul, Minnesota, Dan was 18 years old, a kid of outstanding character, and one of those cases that you read about and you think, my God, how did this guy die? And what a loss to society he is. He was raised in a little town called Eveleth, Minnesota, about 50 miles north of Duluth and just about 30 miles west of Lake Superior. He was missing that geographical cluster area of Eveleth. His parents were Dale and Sally. He was a member of the Resurrection Catholic Church, an altar guy, a Sunday school teacher. He reached the rank of Eagle Scout. He was considered to be an outstanding pianist. He lettered in 3 sports in high school: cross-country, Nordic skiing, and track. He was a member of the National Honor Society, academic scholar, played in the band and an orchestra. He even traveled to Mississippi when he was in high school and did volunteer work for the Habitat for Humanity. In 2008, he graduated from his high school with enough advanced credits to start college as a sophomore. He enrolled at the University of St. Thomas in St. Paul as a sophomore. He had a private Catholic liberal arts school behind him, and that's what he went into. On the night of April 5th, he was 4 blocks from the Mississippi River and 1 mile south of the University of Minnesota. And at that time, he had received 6 different scholarships to attend school. He was courted. He was smart, well-rounded. I couldn't say more about him. He was a type 1 diabetic with an insulin pump. And there's another key point that I talk about, and a lot of the people I've written about over the years, they have some type of debilitation, some type of an unusual nature to their body. It's really hard to explain, but it comes up more than it doesn't. On April 4th, 2009, Dan and his friends went to a party in the 2100 block of St. Clair Avenue, about 6 blocks east of the Mississippi River. At 2 a.m., he left the party, and a friend named Anna called him as he was leaving and said, "Where are you going?" He goes, "I'm just going to go back to my house." And she said, "Where are you?" And he explained, and she started to drive toward him. Well, as they're on the phone, he says on the phone to her, "Oh my gosh, Anna, where are you? Help." And the voice on the phone grew more and more distant with the last few words saying, "Where are you?" And then the phone cut off. Later on in that day, he's reported as a missing person. His father testified in front of the Minnesota House of Representatives, and the testimony dealt with dogs and bloodhounds that were brought to the area where he was seen 6 blocks from the river, never went anywhere near the river. They never had any scent going anywhere close to the river. But the police put in side-scanning sonar in the river and searched it and found nothing. 4 days of searching, rivers, streets, aerial, marine, they found nothing. And they didn't know what to think. Fast forward almost 28 days, May 1st, there's a Ford motor plant on the Mississippi River, and near the intake portion for the plant, a maintenance man found a body, and the wallet and ID on the body was that of Dan Zamlin. They went to the coroner, and they determined that he died from freshwater drowning. The police admitted they don't know where, when, or how Dan entered the river. Now, the parents knew something really weird happened that the police weren't able to explain, and they got the body and they did a second autopsy. And GHB in high levels was found in the liver, and the parents have stated that they don't believe any investigation really happened, and they really don't believe anyone took this incident seriously at the police department. Now, Zamlin and another kid I wrote about named Jay Polhill were both found right near a Ford motor plant. Jay was outside of Chicago. How his body got 20 miles outside of Chicago and in the water near a Ford motor plant, nobody will ever know. Same with Zamlin's. Now, the evidence on this Wisconsin case involving Zamlin was found in a neighborhood, and this is very weird. I don't even know what it means, but directly across from the Ford motor plant is a neighborhood in St. Paul called Hiawatha. In the Wisconsin cases, there was evidence found in the middle of town at a place called the Chief Hiawatha Statue in Wisconsin. I think it's just one of those weird coincidences that I can't explain, but it's true. And the last thing is that there are really no cases in volume before 97. And all of these drownings and disappearances that match this profile point started in really 1997 and continue through today. And the people that have heard about these cases, a couple of them say, well, Dave, really, maybe it isn't just a bunch of drunk college kids falling in the water, blah, blah, blah. And I said, well, there's colleges and universities all over North America that are on rivers and near lakes. And if it was really that prevalent of a problem across the board for college-age kids, then it should be happening across the board all over North America at every college and university.
Right.
But it's not. It's only happening in this real confined area around the Great Lakes and on the East Coast. That's where the majority, 95% of these cases are. It's troubling to me. I don't know how to explain it.
After I read your newest book, and I have your others, after reading this one, I went on probably a 3-day binge of going down a rabbit hole. And, one of the things that I jotted down was, and it's just a theory, just like everybody else has, but going off the fact that there's something unique as far as a disability, or these are very smart folks, take this book in particular, college-age kids, very intelligent, go off your previous books. The predominant age of your previous books is between 2 and 4. Well, at the age of 2, you have more synapse fires in your brain than at any other time of your life. So I'm just wondering if these people of all ages, they become lightning rods because of something inside of them. It's just one of the things that I had jotted down. But Dave, what has been the biggest theory presented to you by your readers as far as the whodunit for missing 411?
I don't think anybody has a theory on this last book. I've had a lot of people say, well, this book isn't really related to the other 4 books.
Oh, I don't know how they say that, to be honest with you.
And I honestly don't think it's the people that have read the books. I think it's people that have heard maybe an interview or two and don't want to make the association. Because to make the association really takes us to a different place.
Right.
And if you look at the disappearances in my other books and you look at the geographical cluster map, this cluster map is not that far from the other cluster map as far as disappearances around the Great Lakes.
Mm-hmm.
And in this book, I talk about a book called The Great Lakes Triangle. And if you get a chance, it's like $4 on Amazon. It's really worth reading. And this author, it's an older book, it's probably 25 years old. Author takes a look at disappearances around the Great Lakes going back hundreds of years and how there's jetliners, military craft, people, boats, ships that have disappeared under extraordinarily unusual conditions around the Great Lakes. And in my other books, I have stated that the geographical clusters seem to occur along the East Coast, water, West Coast, water, Great Lakes, water. The only place really that's far away from water are the disappearances through the Rocky Mountains. And like we said, down the middle of the U.S., north to south, nothing. Nevada, nothing. Mississippi, Louisiana, essentially nothing. So how do you explain all this? The best I could say is I do think water is associated somehow.
It almost seems to be some sort of a conductor or a power source for something. And I think Brian Seach actually mentioned this while we were at Burr Oak and you were speaking. He says it almost seems like they're traveling and they just don't survive the travel, like you mentioned with the person speaking about the wind herd. But, look up X points or the quantum form hypothesis. Not everybody thinks it's funny, and these are people that actually know what they're talking about.
Yeah, I'm not an expert in any of those things, and I don't want to minimize anyone's idea, but I don't have a problem with explaining. I mean, I get theories all the time, and 90% of the theories are pretty easily extinguished because usually the people listen to 1 or 2 interviews, throw a theory at me, don't understand the totality of it, and I'll explain it away pretty easily. Some of the theories I just can't explain away, and I don't know. But I do think that the unusual nature of the deaths and people, medical examiners, unable to tell us why it happened, that's perplexing.
Dave, is there anything else unique about these areas besides the water?
The majority of these cases, all of the cases essentially involve water. I mean, there's even a small cluster in the middle of Arizona with the only large lake anywhere within hundreds of miles, and 3 guys end up in the lake dead.
Right.
So I really don't know, other than, like we've already talked about, the one thing I have said in other interviews, and I'll say it here, is that as you read the book, you're going to notice that there aren't any derelicts in this group. There aren't any drug addicts. There aren't any winos, drunken people that are derelicts of society that you would expect may end up in a body of water dead. That's not happening. These are the cream of the crop. And, New York City, how many derelicts and winos and things do we have? They're not ending up in the river under these circumstances. No, it's the top echelon in that area that are disappearing. It doesn't make sense.
Do you have any family members that contact you seeking to know more about the similarities that you've found in the death of their loved one and other people?
I have in the other books, not about this one yet.
This is something I've always wanted to ask you, is that have you ever been warned to stop doing what you're doing?
From somebody that was warning me in a mean or aggressive way, no. I've had a couple of people that have been in this kind of underworld of arena looking at strange things, just say, hey, keep your eyes in the back of your head sometimes, because, you're dealing in some things that others may not want to come out. So just kind of be forewarned. Truthfully, if somebody wants to really dispose of somebody, I'll have a heart attack, I'll be dead, I'll have a stroke, I'll be dead, and nobody would ever think about it. Or I'll get drunk someday and end up in a river like these guys, and nobody would ever think about it. But if I worried about it, then, I'm kind of worthless as a human being.
Right,
but
that's no way to live.
No. And as long as I'm speaking the truth, and I do, I'm not really worried.
Now, I know that in your previous book, Set in the Woods, I know for a fact that Sasquatch has been blamed many a times. I'm curious to see now, when people read this new book, with the exact same profile points, except with a couple obvious things added in, it will hopefully open people's minds up a little bit and diminish that argument as far as Sasquatch across the board for the previous books.
Well, I think those are the same people that are saying publicly, oh, they're not related. This
Right.
book is not related to the other four, because they can't go to that place in their mind and discount it. That's the only thing they know.
Dave, do you think, especially you've done all the work, you've written the books, are we any closer to finding out what's going on, or are you just finding more questions?
Well, I think we're further down the pipeline. Like I've said before, I think there's spokes in this wheel. And if after the first two books I just closed the books and said, okay, problem solved, we understand it, I think that people would be fooled.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I'm about 5-6 years down that pipeline, and I'm still learning other facets to it. There's got to be other spokes in this wheel I don't understand right now. And truthfully, a lot of people continually send me things from all over the world, because this has worldwide notoriety at this point. And I'm learning about things happening in countries now that I never knew about before. So that's really good. That brings a perspective different than if it's just in the United States or just in Canada. And I suppose these river and lake and pond deaths has shown me that I really have to keep a wide open mind. I can't have narrow vision, and you got to keep pushing, and you got to keep looking. And I know I get pressured all the time. Well, what do you think? And like I said, if I'm not an expert in every one of these abnormal, unusual, strange theories, I'm probably pretty well adept at finding these cases and vetting them to ensure that they match the profile. But as far as an expert in all these other areas, I can't claim that. So don't try to push me into a corner and make a statement that I'm going to regret later on, because that's never going to happen.
So for you, the drive to continue to look into this mystery has not diminished at all?
I can say in the last year it's kind of reinvigorated itself inside of me, knowing that there's this other huge part of it that I never got before. And there's many more things I'm sure out there that'll hit me in the next year or two that I don't know right now. And I think it's a fascinating set of circumstances that probably will continue to evolve as time moves on.
Now, before we get into where people can find you personally to contact you, the website and in the movie, I had to say that I've done this many times online, and that's to correct people to not go to Amazon to pick up the books. Go to your website, canammissing.com. They are $25. Please don't go to Amazon. People cite that as a reason for never wanting to purchase one of your books, and I'm constantly telling them, just go to your website.
Yeah, I think people are so used to going to Amazon for everything that that's the first knee-jerk reaction. I'll just buy it on Amazon. Then you see the book's $100, $200, and you're going, wow, author's trying to rip everybody off. Truth of the matter is, if you just Google Missing 411, our site comes up number one. And yeah, just go to our website. And there's a lot of articles there about up-to-date disappearances just in the last 6 months, and there are a lot. And you may be surprised how many people have disappeared just this last summer.
Mm. So, did you want to mention anything about the Missing 411 movie?
Other than we're right in the middle of filming right now. Luckily, the weather's held out good this summer. We probably have another 3 months of shooting to go. And then it'll probably be at least next September before anybody really hears anything substantial about it. It's got to go to film festivals first and premiere there before we can premiere it anywhere else. Otherwise, the film festivals won't even review it. So it's kind of our backs to the wall, and we got to cater to them. And we've got some really, really good things that have happened just within the last month, so we're pretty excited.
Oh, wonderful. Congratulations on that.
Thanks.
Well, I think first and foremost, everybody loves a great mystery, but, we forget sometimes that there's, I don't think you do, but I think a lot of the readers might, that, there's actual people hurting a lot by what's gone on in their families' lives, and thoughts go out to the family. And Dave, thanks for your work and for coming on Into the Fray.
My pleasure, Shannon. Thanks for the opportunity.
Again, everyone, Dave's website is canammissing.com. That's CANAMmissing.com. iTF is now available on iTunes and Stitcher. If you like us, please go there, give us a rating, and leave a review. It helps us out tremendously. Make sure to visit intothefrayradio.com for blog posts, contact information, episodes, and sign up for the weekly newsletter. If you have a moment, please go to GoFundMe.com. Type in Ryan Sprague into the search bar, and you will see the campaign he has set up